Today we are talking about the question, can states really regulate migration? And should they? This is a contentious question, but some say nationalism is the most potent ideology on the planet today. States are quite heavily involved into migration, and they are quite powerful actors in many areas, and yet we never stop hearing about migration in most political campaigns, in Europe at least, and also in other parts of the world, such as in North America. Does it mean that states' strong involvement about migration has failed? If states are so influential, why do we keep talking about migration? And it has lasted for decades. So there are those who say, yes, they can regulate migration, but they don't do what is necessary. They don't want to do it. That's a contentious topic. And to discuss this question, I wanted to have with me one of the authority in the field of migration and nationalism study, Professor Anna Triandafyllidou from Toronto Metropolitan University. She has an extensive record on publications on all those questions. Anna, thank you very much for accepting to take part in this discussion and tackle this important topic.
Well, thank you for having me, Emmanuel. I'm very pleased to be here.
So we are going to briefly review Professor Anna Triandafyllidou's journey into migration studies, and then she will discuss the arguments in favor of state regulation of migration and the arguments against state regulation of migration, and we will use this discussion in order to highlight current policy implications. So without further ado, Anna, let's get started. How did you come to study migration? How did you engage in the profession of understanding migration in Europe and also in other parts of the world?
Well, thank you for the question. That's for me an important one. I suppose I will have to reveal my age, because I was in high school and at university in the 80s, and I left Greece in 1990 to do my PhD abroad. And my PhD was not on migration. It was on the political behavior, the electoral behavior of minority parties, and not ethnic minority parties, but ideological minority parties. And while I was actually at the European University Institute in Florence, in Italy, doing my PhD, things, as we all know, started happening. Actually, when I started my PhD, we celebrated 1 year from the fall of Berlin Wall. And I know that many young people that I teach today, you tell them what happened in 1989, and they're like, what happened? I don't know. So actually, as we know, the reconnection, what we call the reconnection of Europe, really created a very big change in the field of migration, particularly within Europe. People from Central and Eastern Europe, from the former communist countries, as their states, welfare systems, education systems, labor markets imploded through the transition, started moving quite massively from Central East to West, but also to Southern Europe. So that was a big change, particularly for Greece, also, of course, for Italy and Spain. So Greece transformed overnight from an emigration to an immigration country, or if you want both, an emigration and immigration country. And many people will remember that Greece was pretty xenophile in its attitude. Of course, foreigners were mainly tourists at the time, and often wealthy tourists, or there were the odd student from some sub-Saharan African country or some Asian country studying at one of the universities, some refugees, but it was really a very small population. And so I was at the 4th year of my PhD, and with a colleague that was also studying something else, we wrote a paper together about xenophobia. And that's where it all started for me, because for me it was a big puzzle. How did Greeks turn totally xenophobic, and I would say to a large extent racist, really in a very short time, and also in that actually first work of mine that was later published as a book, which was my postdoctoral study. I looked at how they even constructed an identity where migrants could not be part of. And So that's where it all started, and actually from studying more identity, which was closer to my PhD, because my PhD was about the different strategies of influence that were mostly social psychological strategies of influence for or against ideological minority parties. Then I moved to study identity and those politics of identity in relation to migration, but later I moved more towards issues of migration management, like the issues that we're going to talk today, like the governance of migration, legal, irregular, labor, family, citizenship, etc. But it was a very personal journey, and I think it really had to do with what was happening in Greece at the time and through Southern Europe.
Yes, that's interesting. And we had a similar experience with Evan Crowley. She recounted to us how she moved into migration studies. And for her as well, the end of the Cold War and the large migration flows that succeeded the end of the Cold War were transformative in her thinking and leading her into migration affairs. So does this mean that hopefully we will have a very good harvest of migration scholars in the next years, because migration has been so much present in the last decade in many areas. So, and you started from the point of view of Greece. In this country was a country of immigration, typically towards Germany, especially from the 1960s onwards, and it found itself in the middle of a much more moving area, an area of movement, and turned rapidly from an immigration country, at least partly, to an immigration country, resulting in a wave of xenophobia. And you wanted to better understand what explained this shift. And so, which methods have you used?
How did I understand it?
Or which method do you use?
Well, my methods were more qualitative than quantitative. And maybe I want to say that I did my undergrad at Pantheon University in Athens, but then I did my PhD at the European University Institute, and then I moved to Brussels for a period, working for some projects, and then I did my postdoctoral study at London School of Economics. And I've always been, although I studied statistics at Pantheon, I think I've been more of a qualitative methodology person. And my study was comparing actually Spain, Italy, and Greece, and I was mostly doing what we would call stakeholder interviews, interviewing social and political actors from different walks of life, from mostly people who were really directly involved in the day-to-day of migration, like NGOs, but trade unions, as well as relevant ministries and relevant agencies of the state. Not so much migrants themselves. I would interview migrant associations, and the idea was to understand. And I think I also analyzed newspaper discourses, media discourses, because the idea was to understand how national identity was reconstructed in ways that it excluded migrants, and that was very pronounced in Greece, where it is interesting. We live in Greece is based in a region that actually historically identities have been very much mixed, and we know that Greece had to go through a very strong nation formation process, excluding people and or homogenizing people in the 19th and even through the 20th century. So I think what was interesting was because many of the migrants in Greece were from nearby places, so really culturally and often ethnically connected in their memories, historical memories, the way nations construct their historical memories, connected to Greece, and thus there had to be a dimension that would push them out, and that dimension was the dimension of legality, rule of law, kind of a civic dimension, and that, from a nationalist perspective, is an innovation, because usually the civic dimension is used to bring people in, not to keep them out. But because Greece was actually lacking any immigration policy, people, and because the political and economic reasons why people moved were so compelling, people generally moved without, proper regulation, without documents. And even when they arrived in Greece, there was hardly any way to obtain documents. And we also know, the many troubles of Greek public administration and bureaucracy. So there was this construction that, oh, these migrants are not welcome because they're not documented, because they don't obey the rule of law. But we know that if we look at studies of political culture, and, I'll only mention a couple of the most important thinkers of the 20th century in this, Nikiforos Diamandouros and Nikos Mouzelis, they've all argued that actually Greek political culture doesn't pay much attention to the rule of law. But that's where I'm saying it was really interesting to see how this was reconstructed. And it was also interesting to see that of the three countries, the only country where stakeholders spoke about the immigration experience and about connecting the two were in Spain. It was only in Spain where people said, oh, there's more Spaniards abroad or people of Spanish origin than there is people of non-Spanish origin in Spain. But that is the same for Italy and Greece. But in no one of these two countries anyone commented on that. Rather, the comment was, oh, we went legally, they came without documents. But we also know that is not accurate. But as we know, that's where my social psychological hat comes in. As we know, groups reconstruct their identities in a way that keeps the identities alive and kicking. So it's not something about historical accuracy.
So you use a method of fundamentally interviews, qualitative interviews with actors of migration regulation, members from ministries, but also some non-state actors like NGOs, or intermediary actors, we can say, like trade unions. And so this gives you a wealth of experience precisely to address the question, can those actors really regulate migration? Because I understand you have been close to their doubts, probably, to some of them, to their uncertainty. But what you have just said after it, that your basic experience with these issues in your research has been that state regulation of migration also creates a new reason to differentiate migrants from natives. And as migrants are subjected to documents, to precisely state regulation, this opens up the opportunity for them to be irregular, not to comply by the rules. And even though the rule of law is not so common in some culture in some countries, in the political culture of some countries, it turns back against migrants specifically, and it becomes an additional reason to expel them. So a kind of circular reasoning.
There's two levels of reality. I'm not saying that the reality is not important and that it was not important that people didn't have documents, or sometimes we know that also Greece at the time and to this day favored ethnic origin migrants. So then some people were truly of ethnic origin. The question, some were not. The question was also, how did you prove that? That people had to produce those documents from Greek associations, whether in the former Soviet Union or in Albania. And, it became a whole thing. But I think it is important to understand how there are policies, there are things that happen on the ground, but there are the ways we make sense of these things. And these are different levels of reality that are interconnected. And I think it is important to say that, we can understand an event in different ways, and we can reconstruct it. And in that sense, as you said, going to the field of regulation, migration touches very centrally the notion of sovereignty and the notion of the nation state. So it triggers a lot of, responses. Yes,
absolutely. And we have been talking a lot about the Greek case. It's an element of context also, is the changeability of borders in the greater Balkan region and the very diverse ethnic conditions in that region that make states particularly obsessed with ensuring the proper ethnic composition of the population. But with this introduction, let's move on now on the core of our problem, which is, can state regulate migration? So what are the arguments in favor of state regulations? Because what we have seen so far were rather not really argument in favor of states trying to shape ethnicities in certain way. But let's consider the state as a pertinent actor of migration regulation. What is the argument?
Well, first of all, I want to say that the way we understand migration is very political, and I mean political in the broader sense, not in the narrow sense. So the way we understand migration today has very much to do with the nation state. So we live in what we call we lived in a Westphalian world where the nation state, or what I call the national state, so a state where there is a national majority that feels that the state is its own property and feels as a legitimate actor. So that state has to regulate entry and exit from the territory, and the ethnic, political, linguistic, cultural boundaries have to coincide with the territorial ones. So the way we understand migration has very much to do with that, and it was not always like this. I think this is something we often forget. People within empires, people moved quite freely and seamlessly. The passport itself is a recent invention, and let alone the feeling that when you cross a line, so I now live in Canada, so when you cross that line on the highway between Canada and the US, you leave Canada, you enter the US. That was not the case for the most part of, the human history. There were even border areas, not border lines. So this is very important, and it is not necessary that in the future it will be like this, and we will talk about it a bit more later. So in that sense, I think it is important to say the way migration is understood, it has very much to do with the nation state. This is the first point. I think the second point is that, of course, migration touches upon some very important issues in terms of sovereignty. So, and it touches upon the notion of citizenship. And so if, and as this famous French sociologist Abdelmalek Sayad said in 1982, he said, he called it the immigrant paradox, that migrants are absent from where they should be, their country of origin, they're present where they should not be, at the country of destination. And the should is understood as, in the nationalist doctrine. And in that sense, migrants never get it right, because they are in some ways accused by both societies. The other thing is that sovereignty today has changed. So that is what brings us, and the question arises, if we see that in many other spheres, we cannot regulate our issues from a single state perspective, but we need whether supranational entities, like, for instance, a regional entity like the European Union, or whether we even need to connect through international organizations and regulate a lot of things. Why shouldn't migration be regulated in this way? And why do we think that trade or climate change, just to name two of the most obvious ones, are not a matter of the nation state, but they are a transnational governance matter and not migration nor asylum. So I think that is the main point. On the other hand, it is important to say that the basic social contract is based on the idea that the people who participate in this community, they contribute to the community and they take back from the community. So when a migrant comes in, this kind of upsets the social contract. The thing is, however, in a democracy, the delay in terms of the migrant being part of the citizenry can only be a time delay, and a delay that relates to some conditions. It cannot be an absolute delay. If the migrant does not become a citizen, that really undermines democracy as such. So we need to think of both these 2 points when we think about state regulation of migration.
Yeah, I think that the main argument that you have mentioned, that those who favor state regulation of migration put forward this notion of a form of community, of social contract that migrants can upset, benefiting somehow from this community. And then there is a question whether they contribute. That's the main argument. And then On that basis, states regularly try to control migration and to get it fit in their framework. And you mentioned the process in recent centuries of clear delineation of territories, passport controls, and also a strong link between sovereignty and the capacity to control the population. We were discussing that before. When you have states based on ethnic identities, then it's a matter of extreme importance for them to ensure that their population reflects their identities, especially when there are border conflicts at stake. Here we see also that the border conflicts also come from an attempt at clearly delineating borders and not accepting possible ethnic mix in border areas. So do you want to add anything about the arguments for state regulation of migration?
I think, as you said, I think one question is that of borders, and of course, in that sense, migration can also become a geopolitical question. And actually, we've seen migration and asylum rise into the field of international relations and diplomatic relations. I remember, again, when about 15 years ago, migration started really being elevated to the high end of international relations and international politics, while until that time, security, nuclear armaments, or of course peacekeeping and other issues were, but migration was something that was on the side. But then people realized, states and elites and intellectuals as well realized that migration is pretty central to that. But I want to also add the question about the internal question about why the state regulates migration, but what is actually the dilemma there between inclusivity and exclusivity. And as I said, of course, it is not that when a person comes into a country, they become directly a member of society and a citizen, but certainly there is the well-known, English expression, there's no taxation without representation. So if people come in and work and pay taxes and send their kids to school and participate in society, then they should become citizens, and it should not be a matter of ethnic origin, or some sort, in my view, obviously. But my view, in the sense, not just a personal view, my view as a sociologist and as an intellectual, as a publicly engaged intellectual, my view is that there shouldn't be a closure, because that really undermines democracy and the very essence of community. But I want to give an example, for instance, from Canada, in terms of what are the dilemmas that can come up. So, for instance, Canada, as you probably know, is a country that very much proactively regulates migration, and where immigration is part of the national identity, the national narrative. Famously, Justin Trudeau, who is still the Prime Minister, said in 2015, soon after he was elected for the first time, he said Canada is the first post-national state. And I know that in many places in Europe, this would sound like, oh my God, what is he saying? But anyhow, I want to give this example. So people in Canada come in mostly through what is called economic migration, so through a selection process in relation to, labor market and demographic needs. They have a clear path to permanent residency and then to citizenship. There is an issue, there is a policy issue that with a couple of my colleagues here who've been looking at is what happens with young adults, with children in Canada who are citizens and want to bring their parents, so the so-called PGP, the parents and grandparents. Mm-hmm. And there's been different policies and so far what happens now in Canada is you apply, you say, I have a certain income, I want to bring my parents, my elderly, so to speak, parents, and there is a lottery because there's many more applications, and they have created a cap of I believe 20,000 people per year, and that cap was introduced by the previous Conservative government, and the Liberal government that has been in power since 2015 has not changed it. And if you don't qualify for the lottery, then there is something called the super visa, where you get a 10-year visa for 2-year stays each time, but you have to buy your own health insurance. So you have to buy your own health insurance for your parents. And there's been quite some discussion, because this is discrimination against citizens. So a new citizen that has their parents or grandparents abroad cannot bring them, but a citizen that has been here and have maybe for 2 or 3 generations have this right of, so they can, how can I say, fulfill their duty of care, their duty of familial care to the people closest, beyond their nuclear family to them, but some other citizens don't. So what I want to say there is that it is a complex issue, because on one hand, some people say, yes, but these people worked and lived in another country. They did not contribute to our welfare and to our health system. So we cannot provide for them. They should, be temporary residents, pay for their health insurance, and things can turn complicated, because obviously elderly people may have serious health issues, and some private insurance might say, they say I cover an illness, but I don't cover dementia because that's a condition. On the other hand, so this is also a valid argument in terms of the health system, but there's also a valid argument to say I'm a citizen, and you're discriminating actually against me when you don't allow me to live my life to the full, and I have to, for instance, deprive my children from their grandparents. And again, what I want to say is that these are true dilemmas, and that societies, and polities have to discuss them and solve them in ways that, keep the community actually alive. And that's where I want also to say that this, state regulation of migration is a constant process. There's no one policy that fits all, and then we find this perfect policy and we just keep with that. So I think states and societies have to keep asking themselves who they are, how they're changing. And if we think of Southern Europe, societies have changed very much after 1989. And what is this new we, and how we stay, stay true to our new identity and to democracy?
Yeah, absolutely. And so in this conversation so far, we have discussed why states regulate migration, how they come to regulate migration. And you have argued that it is first based on the identity of the state to regulate migration. It's part and parcel of the state. Here, there is also the question that we can keep for later is, what is the relation between the state and society? Is the state simply representing society, or is the state something on its own? And that was the first reason why states regulate migration, that it's part of their identity. And the second reason we have mentioned is this notion of the social contract, the contribution, healthcare, and so on, that also lead to states to regulate migration. I think it's a good moment to keep the balance and to start thinking about the downside of those objectives of states to regulate migration. And as you have said about grandparents just now, we see the difficulties inherent in this objective of controlling human movement, because it's made of a variety of complex cases. So in your interviews, in your research, what did you observe about difficulties for states to regulate migration, the ethical problems, the practical difficulties, the financial calculations inherent in this attempt of controlling, regulating the movement of people?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Well, first of all, I think we know mobility and migration is part of human history. There's no crisis. This has always happened. And I was reading some scientific blog the other day, just out of personal interest, about how archaeologists are telling us how actually the Homo sapiens, when exactly Homo sapiens moved from different parts of East and Southern Africa to different parts of the Middle East, and apparently France. This is where they have found, the first remains. So this I also use with my students to say, migration is part of surviving on the planet. The second thing is, again, going back to migration within a system of national states. So, and what we said, that there is the understanding that states will regulate their territory, their border, their sovereignty, and migration in that comes as a challenge, and same for asylum seeking protection. So, however, these both migration and asylum are transnational challenges. As we know, borders cannot be guarded from one side. They need two sides to guard the border. And I think the Berlin Wall is the obvious example of how you cannot guard a border on one side unless you're prepared to shoot anyone who is trying to pass, illegally, who is trying to cross. So we need to understand that if we try to regulate borders from one side, there is a big cost, there's a big price to pay in terms of civil liberties. That is one thing. A second thing is, we know the economy today is very much connected. So again, a lot of the products we buy in any one country are actually the outcome of a global value chain. And my favorite example there comes from Italy, which is my kind of adopted country. I've lived for a long time in Italy. And, there's this little sign, made in Italy, that makes garments kind of more expensive and more desirable. But if we look at any garment that is made in Italy, actually it's been made in 3 different world regions, probably 5 countries. So somewhere, say, the wool was produced, then it was made into a thread, then it was made into, oftentimes, for instance, it may have been produced, say, in the wool may have been produced in New Zealand, it may have been thread actually in Italy, then the tissue may have been exported to, say, China or Vietnam. It may have been cut and sewn on the basis of some design. Then actually it can also move between countries while the garment is made. Then the garment goes back to Italy, where the little labels are put and maybe the buttons are sewn, and then it becomes a made in Italy. And so that is also how our smartphones are created. And we don't see that because we don't think of products in that sense. But when we see people, we think, oh, this person should be in their country of birth or in their country of passport. While we don't think of this in relation to the economy. And we've seen this, I think, during the pandemic very vividly, when we realized that a lot of things like protective equipment were produced only in East Asia, and they had to be shipped. And then several countries had to turn several of their industries into industries producing protective equipment, for instance. So in such an interconnected world, and I want also to add on this, communications, both the earlier, newspaper and electronic communication like TV and radio, then it was the internet, now it's social media. So we are so interconnected. And again, there, for instance, for me, a turning point was 2011 and the Arab Spring, and that's where we start seeing what we call citizen journalism. So in 2011, there were potent enough smartphones for people to take videos and photos from what was happening in Cairo and send them around the world. And it opened an opportunity, for instance, for media to then ask people on the ground to act as I said, citizen journalists. And then, for instance, we had Gezi Park in Istanbul, and there too, there was this mobilization, and suddenly we all knew, and we had also Occupy Wall Street, if you remember, and the Indignados movements in the same time, 2010, 11. So suddenly we realized that things that happen elsewhere can be transmitted not just as text, but as images around the world. So with all this interconnectivity, but also interdependence, how can we expect that mobility, physical mobility, will only be regulated by one state? Actually, it's a paradox, and I don't know why many people don't see that. And politicians usually have to say, oh, we're totally in control, don't worry, we're in control of our borders. And they should actually tell the citizens are not stupid. They should tell, actually, we cannot control our border, we can manage our border. We can work on different fronts to make sure that while some movement will still happen spontaneously and perhaps not fully regularly, other movement will happen legally. And in any case, we're working on this. I think that is what states should tell their citizens.
Thank you very much for this detailed explanation. It was really amazing, and it really highlights the way we started the episode. That is, we have nationalism as certainly the most powerful ideology on the planet. We have a strong state discourse about migration, and yet the issue keeps coming back and back, as if states were just unable to do what they claim. And here you made it extremely clear with the detailed examples that you took, that reality is actually much more complex than the simplistic narrative of state identity, in which you have one authority, one community over one territory, and this community had the natural right to decide who enters and who exits, like in a private house. So reality is just much more complex than that. The entire economy, people's existence is made in networks that go way beyond state borders. And so attempting to fit reality with the simplistic nationalist myth becomes inherently Kafkaian. That is, you enter in a complexities that go way beyond the possibility of planification and organization of one single authority. And you have been working yourself also on populism, which is a word that has whose definition can be discussed. But at least to me, populism is the belief that one people organized can dictate reality. That if the will of the people can dictate reality. If the people want things to be like that, it can and it will be like that. But as you have said, this simplistic view can often lead to serious curtailing of liberties and massive abuses.
Yeah, also violation of international law. Now, speaking of populism, actually, you reminded me of Trump. Although in the previous U.S. administration, although I'm afraid that when it comes to migration, this administration of Joe Biden is not doing that much of a better job. But precisely as you said, during the Trump administration, we had this very strong populist discourse that was also, make America great again, Americans first, which to some extent in trade persists. And we can close the border, and actually we also have to think that borders are not just walls; they are digital, walls. The border today is not just physical; it's digital, and behind both the physical and the digital border, there is a big company interests, because there's someone who is selling the equipment, there's someone even who is working in the facilities of control of detention, anything from constructing the facilities to upkeeping, to cleaning, to catering, to security, obviously. And there's very big interest also in the European Union in terms of the companies that sell both the hardware and the software for now our automated control systems, at the borders. And we're all happy when we go through the border. And I, for one, when I'm from Canada, I fly back to Europe, I feel so happy to be an EU citizen, not to have to stand in the line. And I go through the automated border control, but we not only need to think actually about the civil liberties that go behind it, that they take all our data and things like iris scans, but also the fact that there's a very big company interest, there's very big financial interest behind those, and those financial interests actually are usually act at transnational level. So these companies are multinationals, and they actually also build relations with different national governments. And we know that at that level, business becomes also, a state affair. So I think this is very, very interesting to keep in mind. So when we speak about migration and asylum governance, that everything is pretty much transnational. And also I want to add the point on this, that when I started working on migration and asylum was completely different. So we always thought, asylum is something for the lawyers who do international law and human rights, and migration is something for the sociologists, the economists, the political scientists. But it's been, again, 10 to 15 years that the two have come together. I think there's been a very important realization that people move for both economic and political reasons, and it's very hard to say this person is an economic migrant and this person is an asylum seeker, because oftentimes this person is moving mainly because there's violence and conflict in their country, but they also have aspirations and plans about what their future will be. So they would like to make a choice. I want to go there and build my life there. And similarly, someone who is moving in search of a better income, for instance, again, I'll give an example. In Canada, we have a significant number of highly skilled people from sub-Saharan Africa that come to Canada as international students or as economic migrants. And these are people that are well off and have great jobs, but they might be concerned that in their country, there's not significant political stability. So they are concerned about the future. While technically speaking, this person is an economic migrant, if we look at the motivation, there is a part that is political. So I think that is another area where we need more sincere communication from the governments to say it is not, again, while we do have different instruments, and even with regard to the global governance, we've created this two voluntary mechanism of the global compacts. The phenomena on the ground are very intertwined. And of course, we have to give protection to people who need protection. So there's people who come from Afghanistan, who come from Syria, there's people who come now from Sudan, formerly from Eritrea and Ethiopia, that are very clearly prima facie refugees. But there is a lot of intermediary situations that we need to examine. And this is important because, again, this is part of who we are as an international community. And the reason why the international community steps in is because it says the single state cannot deal with this. So I'm here to make things happen. That's actually where the governance of asylum comes from, where the international community says, this state is failing to protect its citizens, I need to step in. But we see this now also in relation to migration.
Yes, so this is a further elaboration of the complexity and the contradictions inherent in attempting to fit a simple model of national sovereignty over the complex reality of human experience and human life. You mentioned the case of the distinctions between asylum seekers and economic migrants, and we had an episode with, again, Evan Crowley, who discussed this issue and how a lot of her work, she said, was about challenging these categories. That is, one person who leaves a country at war is initially a genuine asylum seeker, but then this person, for instance, leaves Sudan, then goes to another Tunisia or Egypt.
Starts working, yeah.
Starts working there, and then because they cannot make it there, move further and becomes an economic migrant. And on the other hand, you have people who leave a poor country like Chad and go to Libya, where they become asylum seekers when they move further north. So all this is meant to say that the simple categories that all migration policies include, differentiation between economic migrants, asylum seekers, get blurred in the complexity of individual trajectories and human experience. And faced with this contradiction, you also mentioned the case of those big companies that actually live with the attempt at filling the gap between simplistic political discourse and reality by building walls, by building digital walls sometimes. And yeah, we had a previous episode with Lucila Rodriguez Alarcon, who is from Madrid. It's an association named Por Causa, and they discuss migration in the media, and they put forward this notion of industry of migration control. And what you are adding now is that the most interesting part of it is that this industry of migration control itself is transnational. So you have a transnational networks of firms whose business is precisely to keep alive the myth that you can have a world of well-defined, well-separated communities. That at least can decide exactly who enters and who exits, despite the complexity of human reality. Does it sum up well your points?
Absolutely. Actually, yesterday here in Toronto at my university, Toronto Metropolitan University, we had a workshop on the datafication of migration governance, and several of the papers were actually very worrying in showing, for instance, how can I call it, the interdigitation of those people who start maybe from working for intelligence and security, then pivot to IT, then pivot back. They pivot between government and big companies, looking at both. Actually, we were mostly looking at the software and at databases, and how actually today it is more the technological capacity that shapes migration governance, rather than deciding what and how we want to govern and then use the technical tools that we have. It's very much interactive, and sometimes even the possibility of gathering data, somehow then decides what we do with the data, rather than thinking what kind of data we want, and then how do we go about finding those data. And actually, in my research program here, we have a very interesting policy brief for those who want to read it, where we actually also ask for parsimony in creating data, because right now every international organization, and the obvious example would be IOM, and their displacement matrix, they're collecting data from different points without much oversight, also because they are international organizations, and so they're not under the oversight of a specific government, specific regulations. And while this data may initially be gathered for good purposes, so for purposes to alert that there's been an emergency, there's been a crisis, so people are going towards, for instance, a certain refugee camp, and there's many women and children, that's where it started. Or advise that refugee camp, there's people coming, there's many children, you need to have, I don't know, powder milk for infants. But these data now travel very easily, and oftentimes there's no oversight in what happens to them. Or when IOM actually did, for instance, and still does in many places, these regional operations trying to facilitate, for instance, at the time of the Libya crisis, they were facilitating return of people from different sub-Saharan African countries who had been established and had been working for years in Libya, and they needed to go back, and it was even a question, go back to what? They had been away for a very long time. And for instance, IOM is registering people at borders and uses this data for us researchers to see our nice graphs and these maps, where so many people crossed here, there, today, this week, etc. And we don't realize this. People didn't give consent for this use of their data, because people are in distress. They're traveling forward or returning, oftentimes in very difficult situations, and they are registered. Oftentimes, I don't believe there is informed consent on those occasions about you're giving your data for what purpose and for what purpose not. So there's a lot of issues there in the transnational governance that we need to keep in mind. The other element that I think militates in favor of transnational governance, and we often don't think about, take generally this approach of the European Union in the last 10 years to engage with Africa as a country that is, as a region that is still demographically very active, or more active than Europe, that is actually demographically aging fast, or in North America the same. Asia actually is also, East Asia is, we know that China has a huge demographic challenge ahead of it. So not only we realize that we cannot deal with these issues at the single state level, and particularly for the states that are at the geographical periphery of Europe, like Greece and Italy, but also at states like Germany or Sweden, who are geographically not marginal. But then we realized that it is a matter that where the EU needs to act. But even there, we have to realize that the EU has to act on different fronts. So there are bilateral relations with specific countries, but there are also relations with the African Union. And then when we look at what happens on the ground, and probably Heaven Crawley has spoken about that, unfortunately, a lot of the things that the EU does in those regions affect their own intra-regional migration patterns. So when the EU solidifies borders and closes borders and creates technical capacity and know-how on how to regulate border, this actually destroys cross-regional trade, destroys a lot of informal economic activity that is happening, for instance, within the ECOWAS region, the region of West Africa, between countries of the Sahel and big countries in the region like Nigeria. So it's so much interconnected that we cannot say that we have to govern migration at the national level, and let alone the more complex issues on the fact that what is happening in Africa and the borders in Africa are post-colonial borders. They're not the borders they had themselves. And of course, it is a moot question to say what would have happened if colonialism would not have happened. I don't know. We cannot know. But we need to take ownership of this historical legacy and of this historical responsibility, that even the way states are organized, the fact that many ethnic groups or linguistic groups are divided among two or more states in Africa, or what you said about state-society relations are very much the product of colonialism and post-colonial economic dependency. So migration is part of this whole. It's not just something, it's not that we have regulated our world in very neat national borders and national states that are sovereign, and suddenly migration happens and it upsets the puzzle. And that's where I'm worried, because I'm worried that the media often, and governments and political parties often present those simplistic images, and people who don't work on migration, obviously they believe those simplistic accounts.
Yes, and we have all been born with these maps of the world with clearly delineated borders and country names, as if these were the individuals of the world society. And you have again shown very well that things are way more complex, and that precisely the attempts to regulate migration lead states into the dependency of international organizations, because there are a lot of transnational factors. You mentioned the International Organization for Migration.
Yeah.
And we enter further into the contradiction, the unintended consequences when you refer to ECOWAS, that is the Economic Community of West African States. This the EU has been engaged in a program of externalization of migration controls, because EU authorities realized that the simple borders doesn't work. They need to push their border control further upstream of migration flows. And as you have explained, this has led to some kind of consolidation of borders within the ECOWAS communities in West Africa, thereby disrupting trade flows within the area, and thereby also, I would say, most probably preventing further development in this area. So here we see the exact contradiction of what they want to do, because they claim that they prefer to have developments in the countries of origin rather than having migration. But by externalizing their migration controls, they create a new obstacle to development in the regions of origin. So we have shown how much the very big contrast between a simple discourse of state sovereignty, cohesive communities, clearly delineated borders, and the reality of a complex human economy, experience, social life, and the contradictions between the two leads to sometimes very absurd results. Those transnational companies that regulate the illusion, that are here to maintain the illusion of a national world, the development that is hindered precisely by the policies that depend on development, because you expect development to reduce migration flows. So let's take a step back now about all this, and how do you see experts on those questions being able to face a demand? Because all those contradictions, they must face a demand of knowledge, of expertise. How can migration scholars like you have an impact and respond to a demand in, I don't know if the word society is the correct one, but in those problems? Do you feel a demand for experts, first of all?
Yeah, well, first of all, I have to say migration is this kind of argument. So, for instance, I think if you're a doctor, say you're whatever, a specialist in some, you're a cardiologist and a surgeon, you go to a dinner party, nobody will say, I'm an expert, I'm going to tell you how to do your work. But with migration, you go to a dinner party and people tell you, let me tell you how you should, what we should do with migration. And if you try to explain, for instance, why a policy doesn't work or what are the dilemmas, like I was saying now, they would say, no, you don't know because you live in your books. Let me tell you my personal experience. I remember on one occasion, again, at the time I was in Florence, and we, after a conference, we were having dinner with some colleagues, and there was this colleague who is an economist from the US, nothing to do with migration, and he was giving us lectures how we had misunderstood multiculturalism, and he could tell us how things work because he grew up in Los Angeles, and there were a lot of migrants in Los Angeles. So migration is one of these topics where everyone feels they can be an expert. A second thing is governments. We speak a lot about evidence-based policy making, and I think it's very much, how can I say, a buzzword, and it's even a cover-up, in my view, because governments generally decide what policy they want, and then they ask for the evidence. It's not that they look at the evidence and then try to decide their policy. Of course, there's different degrees to that. I'm afraid that there's a little, I don't want to speak negatively about Greece, but let's say in Greek governments have not, to a large extent, have not listened to any sort of analysis, have not looked for data or for analysis to at least inform their policies or to create policies that are not reactive, trying to make it up for things that are happening, but are more proactive and realistic. So policies that see that migration is part and parcel of economy and society, and there is a balance between, for instance, what can be conceived as interests of the state, interests of different communities, because also within society, for instance, the employers of potential migrants have a different interest compared to the local workers who will compete with some migrants for the same job. And so there's no single national interest on migration. Then, for instance, there are countries like Canada where we have a great cooperation with both the Ministry of Immigration and the part of the government that is called Immigration, Refugees, Citizenship Canada, which is the body that both plans and implements different migration and asylum policy. I'm not saying, though, that Canada is listening to the researchers, but at least, for instance, to give an example, the Canadian government has said and will do a regularization program probably within the next year. And it is in the program, and it is expected. So they are consulting with civil society and with experts and with everyone who has experience and expertise on the issue in preparing this program. Now, of course, the final decision is very much a political one, and there are interests that governments try to balance, including what they believe the electorate wants. but also what they see is important for society and the economy. But I think it is important. And on this front, actually, I have to say, for instance, all the research that we've done on irregular migration has been pretty much ignored by the European Union, although we had a lot of policy briefs, a lot of policy workshops. Again, I'm sure Heaven has participated in those as much as I have in the last 15 years. But when we look at the policies adopted, 80% of the time, if not 90% of the time, they were completely contrary to what we were suggesting. So going back to what is our responsibility, I think we certainly have the responsibility as publicly engaged academics to speak up our voice and try also to explain complex, questions in simple words. In simple words, and I think on this, for instance, the audiovisual, opportunities like the one we're having now together to explain things in more simple language. For instance, use infographics, use graphic representations. Sometimes also use, for instance, individual stories to illustrate both what policy works and what policy doesn't work, or illustrate the dilemmas, so that people can relate, and both the electorate can make more informed decisions when they have to vote or when they participate in other ways in politics, but also policymakers can take informed decisions. And again, to use another example, you will remember in 2015-16 when we had the obligatory quotas for refugee, reallocation within the EU, as there was intense pressure of people going mainly through Turkey and Greece and going further north and west. That was an issue that was being debated in the academic community at the time for 2 or 3 years, and there were different proposals, including making refugee quotas like the CO2 quotas that you could trade them. And it was just serendipity that these ideas were taken up at the time of the European Commission. And I think, unfortunately, there hadn't been very good communication between, if you want, the expert community and the policy community. So it was just a happy coincidence. And a good friend of mine and former colleague and former also Eliam member, Ruby Gropas, who now works in Brussels, was actually telling me, and she was trying to do her best in her capacity then at the European Political Strategy Center, to say to the people higher up who were making the decisions, look, there is this body of evidence to say how you can do these quotas. So this was this also says something about how sometimes informal channels, discussion groups, even personal relations, also the importance of having academics work in government and have government people also have academic careers, play a crucial role in circulating this knowledge and helping make this evidence-based policy making happen, because it is often just an empty phrase. So certainly we have a responsibility in that as researchers.
Yes, and you seem to be of a similar opinion as both Evan Crowley, we mentioned, but also Maurizio Ambrosini, who was in this podcast a few months ago, and both were rather pessimistic about the actual demand for expertise in this area, precisely because maybe of the contradiction between what states want, given their identity, and the conclusion towards which my recent scholars tend generally to go, and which is the result of this complexity you have mentioned, and being well aware that trying to regulate migration is like trying to regulate the streams in the ocean. You will not make it. You will not.
Exactly.
Make it.
That's a very nice. But it's a natural force. People move. People. Yes, it's part of human creativity.
Yes, but states nevertheless cannot give up.
Try to.
trying to, because they are based on that, both for sovereignty reasons, and then when you start having extensive redistribution with healthcare and so on, then it becomes even more tricky, because you have potential people who potentially benefit without contributing, and then things get even more complex. But to yes, this is I would say this is a pity, because on the one hand there is this lack of real demand, and you mentioned people who at dinner parties or even elsewhere improvise themselves as migration experts, and on the other hand, I think it's really an area of human development where there would be massive benefits if we were just following a better approach. Some people say trillions of dollars or euros of GDP could be won if there was just a free mobility of people and production factors and so on. So that is something that could really foster massive growth. And actually, we don't have cases of major economic developments that doesn't have as well a migratory dimension. If you look at China, for instance, China's massive economic development over the last 3 and 4 decades has been fueled by migration from the inland of China, from the hinterland to the shores, to the big cities. And without this movement of people, China would not be where it is today. And you can think as well about the United States.
Many other cases, India has important internal migration. And again, in China, they have the hukou system. So actually, even within China, you're not free to move where you want. And that there have been a lot of issues that Chinese colleagues have been studying in terms of the vulnerabilities that internal migrants are facing in the big cities where they're not registered and they cannot access any welfare. But I think it's very important what you say about the costs, because the costs of migration control are both the direct costs, so money paid to these companies, money spent on border control. There are the human costs, the loss of human life, but also there are the many indirect costs of loss of human creativity and productivity, loss of all the potential that you were mentioning. And this is, this is not to say that I'm calling for open borders, but certainly I think we need to keep a broader view of, how migration and mobility relates to development, and how it relates, what I said, to other economic activities. So we cannot expect to have global value chains and trade and communication around the world, but then think that people will stay put into their countries. And I also want to, in conclusion, raise this, that of course would merit a whole other discussion, that Europe is an aging continent, is very fast aging. Yesterday, actually, I was reading an article on the demographic projections on Italy, and they're bleak. And I'm afraid that the demographic projections of Greece are equally bleak. And with the exception of France and the UK, that are very close to reproducing themselves and have net migration, positive net migration, Central Eastern Europe, the situation is very dire. There's been a recent study also on what will be the impact of the war, the invasion in Ukraine, in terms of the demographic future of the country. So I think that this needs to be taken into account. And again, the country where I'm based now, Canada, has a plan to increase its population. I might say it's a big country and we're a few people. We're about 40 million, and the country is, the second largest in the world. But of course, a lot of the territory is not very inhabitable. But there is a plan to increase the population through migration, because there is this view that also the more we produce, the more we consume, the more we will be well off, and the more we will have clout in the world. And I think Europe should think very, should have some forward thinking on this topic, rather than let the political discourse be dominated by actually, this so-called big replacement theory. As I said, people have always mixed. There's nothing new in this.
Mhm. Yeah, and this issue of aging is, let's say, also part of the bigger question we were discussing of complexity. That is, how you have different birth rates between countries, and especially when in one country you have a pension system through redistribution from the active to the retired, then it makes things even more in search of adjustments when you have different rates of population growth and when you have actually population decline in certain areas. So we have discussed the contradiction between the reasons that lead states to regulate migration, the identity, the attempts at managing a community, and the complex reality on the other hand. So, in a final word, would you say that who is going to adapt to who? The identity of the state or the reality, the complex reality of human life? Do you think that being a migration scholar at the end of the day is about thinking about the identity of the state and the ways the state should regulate itself?
I think it's an interactive process, as you said. It's going to be a mutual process, and of course, reality has a certain force and changes society and even changes institutions. But I think it is important to say that the state has a role to play, both in terms of providing and organizing society, but also I think leadership is important. In my view, because of course societies have the leaders that they deserve, as we say, or the leaders that they want. But it is important that leaders sometimes can shape discourses. So when critical dilemmas come up, leadership has to be informed by values, by who we want to be, what kind of society we want to be, and not just by economic interest. So I think this we shouldn't forget. And again, I would like to give an example from Italy, from a politician that is by now vilified and certainly hasn't done many things wrong. But when in 2013 there was a huge shipwreck outside Lampedusa in southern Italy, the then center-left government and Matteo Renzi, then prime minister, introduced the Triton operation, which was a very extensive search and rescue operation of the Italian Navy to go to search and rescue people that were living in Libya in unworthy dinghies. Now the operation was very costly. It was about 11 to 12 million per month. It lasted a year. Then it was replaced by a European operation that was less extensive in terms of search and rescue, and we might say the rest is history. But what I want to emphasize is that Matteo Renzi refused to discuss the economic argument, and you can imagine the opposition that is now in power was, very vocal, saying, "Oh, you spend X amount on each asylum seeker, you don't spend this amount on an Italian citizen with invalidity, etc." And he said, "When people drown at sea, I cannot turn the other side. And I'm not even going to wait for a Brussels decision. I'm going to act now because this is the society we want to be." So again, there's many things to take into account, but I think this is something that we shouldn't lose sight of. At the end of the day, it's about our values and it's about who we want to be. It's not just about economic interests.
All right. Thank you very much, Anna Triandafyllidou. It was a very rich and insightful discussion. And can you tell us where listeners can follow you? Are you on any social media where they can follow your
both
work?
on Twitter at Triandafyllidou. Facebook, LinkedIn, everywhere you can find me. Maybe I can do a little plug. I hold the Canada Excellence Research Chair in Migration and Integration at Toronto Metropolitan University. And if you Google CERC Migration, CERC Migration, you can find us. And people are very welcome to follow our newsletter.
CERC Migration. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.